Okay, the recording has started. And just so that everyone stays on schedule, I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name is Megan Stromberg, and I work for the Resources, and it's part of the strategic initiatives. And our mission is to provide helpful resources, training, and opportunities for those interested in pursuing a career in agriculture. Today begins our winter webinar series. Mr. Don Webster will be the presenter today, and Mr. Webster is a senior agent and regional specialist with the University of Maryland Extension team, and his expertise is in marine science, commercial aquaculture, commercial fisheries, seafood handling and processing, and aquaculture policies. I will now pass it on over to Mr. Webster to begin the webinar.
Megan, thank you very much, and welcome everybody. It's interesting. I thought this was just going out to list for Maryland potential beginning farmers, but it got picked up by several listservs. So we've got quite a few people. It'd be interesting to see from around the country. Number of years ago, I had a good friend who was president of the Somerset County Farm Bureau here in Maryland. He went to their annual state convention one year to get a couple of resolutions put on the floor. He stood up and he introduced himself. And he said, "I'm a farmer too, only my farm's underwater." And everybody in the audience kind of stopped talking to each other and looked at him. What did he say? And he went on to tell them how he ran an oyster hatchery in Somerset County and leased ground from the state to raise oysters. And yes, he was a farmer too. He ended up getting both of his resolutions passed by the Farm Bureau, and they have been a great help to us ever since. What we're going to do today, I'd like to go through and show, we'll cover the what and why of aquaculture, species that are cultured here and elsewhere, some of the Maryland research and extension that's gone on over the years. Make note of, I've been here for about 4 decades and been very fortunate to have worked with a lot of great colleagues and a lot of good projects over the years. We're going to concentrate basically on shellfish systems and technology, oysters, because that's where the action's been here in Maryland over the past decade. And then for those of you who are interested in perhaps proceeding in that direction, where to go for assistance, and then cover where the future of aquaculture we see being in the state. First things first, aquaculture is agriculture. It is the farming of aquatic animals and plants, covers finfish, shellfish, and aquatic plants that are raised in a variety of culture systems and for many applications and markets. It's an old industry in many areas, but with new species and systems being developed around the world. There was a book that was published in the late 1800s here in Maryland by Johns Hopkins professor William K. Brooks. It was called The Oyster, and it talked about the oyster resource at the time, which he maintained was being severely overfished. And he did talk about how ancient Romans used to take groups of sticks, tie them together, weight them with a rock and sink them down. Oyster larvae would come along, attached to the sticks, and eventually weight them down, and they'd be oyster farming. Certainly finfish have been raised in Asia and many other countries for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. And it's really been fascinating to me to pick up any of the many aquaculture publications that come out monthly and see the tremendous expansion in research and development that's going on with both species and systems. Well, there's been a lot of movement into the marine environment. Why do that? Because according to the American Farmland Trust, 31 million acres of farmland were lost between 1992 and 2012, which is equal to all the farmland in Iowa. 11 million of that was considered prime, with 59% in expanding urban areas and 41% to low density development. Energy is a contributor to a lot of farmland loss, and we've seen that. That's one of the issues down here in Maryland is you put solar panels on farmland to generate electricity. So it's been very interesting. There are many other species that are raised both in freshwater and saltwater. Certainly, the U.S. States like Idaho, Pennsylvania, in trout farming, catfish out of Mississippi and a lot of the southern states. There's a bait fish culture and many other things that are raised in the U.S. And in the future, we've seen a lot of increase in movement over the years. The salmon. When I was a boy, you got salmon either fresh during the season when they caught it in Alaska, or you found it canned. Today, salmon is a staple. We find farm salmon, 12 months a year in all of our markets. A lot of those are raised in net pens in inland and places like the fjords, Norway, where it started, and spread to Scotland, Canada, parts of the U.S., Chile. Um, some of the offshore work that's been done has been really fascinating with these giant cages. The concept is you could put them off in the oceans, raise fish essentially in an underwater corral. If you look at the bottom left, seaweeds have become a big area of interest. Places like up in New England where they're raising sugar kelp, often in conjunction with others, multi-trophic aquaculture. I know folks who raise mussels, oysters, and sugar kelp on farms up in New England. And the bottom right there was an interesting conception of a ship that Norwegians conceived of that would actually go and raise salmon at sea in giant net pens where they'd be out in the ocean and where some of the issues of waste and other ones wouldn't be as prevalent. Here in Maryland, we've done a lot of different work with aquaculture. One of our big industries, of course, here in the Bay is crabs, blue crab. And as those crabs grow, they develop a new shell underneath the existing one. And when they're ready to grow, they split the old shell back out of it and then sit there and pump water in and take the calcium out and build their new shell. But when they do that, they make soft shell crabs. And that's been a real delicacy down here for a very long time. Initially, watermen would take those crabs called peelers. They'd put them in floats near their boats, or then they put tanks up on land and flowed water through them to hold them. And they'd come down and have to cull through the tanks several times daily to remove the soft shell crabs. But back in the 80s and 90s, we did a lot of work with recirculating systems to hold soft crabs where they could, the water could be purified through different filtration systems. It actually helped to minimize the mortality on the crabs and increase profitability. So recirculating crab shedding system has been a staple down here for a long time. In the 80s and 90s, my colleague Reggie Harrell did a great deal of work in striped bass and hybrid production here in Maryland. We had several farms that were engaged in it for a time, but the industry pretty well went south after that. But Reggie is one of the world experts in both striped bass and hybrids, and it's been very neat to work with him over the years. We had quite a few recirculating fish culture systems back in that period of time, mostly raising tilapia to be taken into Asian areas and sold live. With that industry as well, that's sort of aggregated into fewer larger places around the country now. We had some companies that actually looked at a business plan of eventually getting into processing of them, but then we saw a lot of that culture going to overseas countries like Costa Rica, where both the land and the labor costs were a lot less than here. And you saw fish coming in, fillets coming in at less than they could be produced here. Aquatic plants have been industry in Maryland. The one photograph that's down on the bottom there, we've done a lot with those. My colleague Andy Lazur and I had a project with, we have about 30,000 ponds in the state of Maryland. Most of those for our stormwater retention ponds. They're made to trap nutrient-laden sediments before they go into the Chesapeake Bay. But however, when they do that, it causes a lot of problems in those ponds. Most of them are in communities. And eventually the ponds would get rather nasty looking, overgrown with filamentous algae and things of that sort. And we developed a project to use aquatic plants in what we call floating wetlands, that went out into the ponds with aeration under them to upwell nutrients to the roots. And it did a really nice job of cleaning up those bodies of water. We did that with our friend Dick Shuck, who runs Maryland Aquatic Nurseries up in Jarrettsville. We have another large operation called Lily Ponds Water Gardens up in central Maryland. Dick and his operation raises a whole suite of different aquatic plants, beautiful ones for use in water gardens, as well as raising ornamental fish like koi that with their beautiful markings look very nice in those gardens. So it's an industry that's done very well here. Another company over here on the Eastern Shore called Environmental Concern was a pioneer in the use of plants for vegetative shoreline erosion control. Very, very neat operation that's actually supported by the state of Maryland now. Over the decades, actually the centuries, oyster aquaculture has been here in the Chesapeake Bay, and it's had a lot of controversy. So when I first moved here to Maryland, we had a major oyster industry. Our industry was harvesting 2.5 to 3 million bushels of oysters a year. We had both public fishery as well as aquaculture. A lot of we had disease problems that occurred throughout the 1980s that caused that resource to become decimated. And we're trying to rebuild that now, as well as try to rebuild the industry that it once supported. Oyster Reefs, when John Smith got here back in the 1600s, they came right to the surface. They were three-dimensional reefs. We had billions of oysters in the bay, but over time the reefs were torn down, they were harvested and sold largely for human consumption. And the oyster reefs are extremely important because they're a keystone species in the bay, and they provide habitat for many other species, along with their biofiltration, which really helps with the phytoplankton that we have in the bay. Why were they? What happened to them? Well, largely they were sold. In the early 1800s, a lot of the oyster reefs in the northern states were decimated. They looked down here and saw this resource, came down and brought the towed oyster dredge, and it eventually had harvesters who went where they wanted, when they wanted, harvested what they wanted, and it became the oyster wars of the Chesapeake, which led to the creation of both the Maryland Oyster Navy, which is today our modern natural resources police force. But one of the things that caused that was being able to shuck and can oysters, the early canning technology, early refrigeration. And the big one was expansion of the railroads to the west in the 1800s, which opened up vast new markets for these products. Today, we see oysters that are still shucked and sold in pints, quarts, and gallons. We see some that are processed and sold in supermarkets as frozen product, and we have a great interest in the production of single oysters for the proliferation of restaurants and raw bars. You can see the high quality of some of those right there. One of the things that's made this possible to rebuild this resource in the industry is oyster aquaculture, and specifically hatchery-based oyster aquaculture. If you look at hatcheries, they basically the progression through there is broodstock conditioning, getting them ready to spawn, then the actual spawning of the animals through mass spawning or strip spawning. When they eggs and sperm form, when the sperm fertilizes the eggs, they form larvae, and they have a period of time of one few weeks that they actually are free swimming. The larval rearing does require some training and facilities, as well as the algae production that is used to feed them. When they are ready to metamorphose and turn into oysters, they're placed into places where they can attach to other generally other shell or other ground up shell. Then they may or may not go through a nursery phase, a short one to a long one. and then ultimately out for a grow out, depending on the methods and markets that are used. The line between those is there for a purpose, is that it generally takes more highly trained technical labor to run the hatchery portion of that with the conditioning, spawning, larval rearing, and algae than it does the others. And the setting nursery and grow out is quite readily able to be learned by oyster growers. These are some pictures of the hatchery operations at the University of Maryland operates the Horn Point Oyster Hatchery over here on the eastern shore near Cambridge in the Choptank River. It's one of the largest in the United States for our eastern oyster, Crassosteria virginica. In good years, it has produced upwards of 1.6 to 1.7 billion oysters for large-scale restoration and commercial development. And you can see the broodstock conditioning going on. These oysters are brought in early, usually in January. The water is heated and flows through them. Essentially, it gets them, tricks them into thinking that spring is coming and it's time to get ready to think of spawning. They build up their gonads over a period of weeks, and when they're checked, when they're ready to spawn, they're taken over to a spawning table. This is for mass spawning. And Bob and Stephen, they'll sacrifice a couple of oysters, put eggs and sperm in the water. That's circulated and sensed by those oysters, basically told it's July and time to get into spawning mode. As they notice the eggs and sperm being expelled from the animals, they'll take and put them in different containers and then fertilize the eggs. And then they become larvae. The larvae are placed in large tanks where the water is sterilized before it goes in there. They are at that point very minute, generally 240 microns and less. And they are checked periodically using microscopes to see how they're doing. And they're fed a diet of 4 different types of phytoplankton that is computer sensed and fed in according to the computer program to make sure that the larvae are well fed and active. When they're ready to go through metamorphosis, they'll develop a little black spot on them, an eye spot. They become eyed larvae. They're drained down, hit with cold water, which causes them to contract and go dormant. To show you how many there are, that ball that's in the hatchery worker's hand there contains over 9 million oysters. I have a little vial in my office I take to programs that has a million preserved oyster larvae in it. And we always make sure that people know if every oyster survived, you'd have over 3,000 bushels there at when they reach market size. Obviously, they don't all survive. When they are ready to go through metamorphosis, there are different ways that we place them on substrate. For making individual seed oysters, they go through these downwiller units where there's a very minute screen on the bottom of that. There's crushed up oyster shell, ground up oyster shell placed on it. The larvae go in there, water flows in down through the substrate and out the bottom of the bucket, and the larvae are given a chance to attach to those individual pieces of ground up shell. They're then taken over and placed in silo units. Water flows up through them and they're kept in suspension. And the more they grow, the heavier they become. And the more the flow of water has to become to keep them in suspension. When they reach a large enough size, they're taken to upweller units. These are generally placed outside. And in this, the water comes in at the bottom. The seed is placed on screens. It flows up through the oysters. They feed on the phytoplankton that's in the water. And then the waste material is carried up and out the outfall pipes. Those are oysters that are generally going into our water column gear. And these are raising single oysters for the half shell and restaurant trade. There's a range of different types of gear that's used now. This was one of the first, which is bottom cages. These are anywhere from 4 feet by 4 feet to 8 feet by 8 feet. They can be 1 or 2 units high. They generally have legs on them so that they sit on the bottom. And you lower them down. They feed on the phytoplankton that's in the water. They have to be periodically brought up, and the cages and all cleaned, and the animals sorted and graded. The shot on the right is a drone shot of one of our bottom culture leases, bottom cage leases rather. And you can see the number of cages there, each one with a little buoy on it. One of the interesting things you can see, while there's quite a few oysters there, generally they're planted at 200 to 300,000 per acre. There's still a lot of area that's not utilized with those. Another culture method that's been popular for many years is surface floats. The top left picture shows what's called a Taylor float. That's a PVC pipe frame, and the plastic mesh bags of oysters are slung across them, fastened to that frame. This is one of our older companies in Maryland. It's near the Horn Point Hatchery, actually, over here on the shore. It's done a very, very nice job of marketing their oysters for a long time. In those cages, you'll go out there and flip them over periodically so that the um, um, bags that are on top will desiccate and the oysters will still be able to feed. We've seen some other really interesting equipment that's come down from places like Canada. The Oyster Grow and Go Deep units are a couple of tiers deep. They generally have 6 slots in them for placement of bags, and they have these floats on them with removable end caps. Obviously, they were developed in Canada where they have such a thing as ice up there during the winter. And what they'll do is they'll flip those so that the floats are down, remove the end caps, and then they or sink them down to the bottom to get below the levels of the ice. When the oysters are feeding, those floats are on the surface with the cages held just beneath them. We have some companies here that have used these very effectively. And one of the very interesting things that we've seen with these is that they, when they're in areas that have a lot of heavy weather, they tend to dampen the waves, attenuation on shore, and can be very useful as a shoreline erosion control method. They are, however, quite visible. And some of the issues that you get into with shoreline property owners that don't want to see these are the so-called NIMBY issues, or not in my backyard, I don't want to see these out there. But you have to understand that they do a very, very good job in growing oysters, which result in increased economy, employment, and environmental benefits. One of the other ones that we've seen come in here in recent years is we refer to as kind of midwater gear. These are from Australia, and the companies are SEPA and BST. And these are used, so one of our companies, the bottom right there, you see that's a Madhouse Oyster Company that uses them for the production of their seed. They use them in the early life stages of the animals, and then they take them out and put them in bottom cages. But you can also use these to raise market oysters, and they become quite popular with a lot of our growers as well. We have a demonstration oyster farm, which is also located where the Horn Point Hatchery is down there in the chop tank, where my colleague Shannon Hood works with about 6 different types of water column gear, doing different research projects, trying to look at which do they produce oysters that vary in meat quality, size, and growth rates. So if we are not in a COVID shutdown, we use that farm both for programs as well as people can arrange to have individual visits down there if they want to see the gear and what's being done with them. It's been a very good operation in the 5 or 6 years that we've had it down there. Contained oysters generally have to be cleaned, sorted, and graded periodically, and this can either be done by hand on smaller operations, or for large ones, there is mechanization that occurs. You can look at the large tumblers there, where they'll tumble the oysters, break off new growth from the bill, which also helps them to grow into a deeper, more rounded shape. They're also graded according to size and then replaced back in gear according to those sizes. Over on the right there are some of the vibrating sorting and grading equipment that a couple of our farms have used. But one of the things you need to point out is not only is the equipment cost money, but it does take significantly a lot of labor to keep those clean. Anything you put in the water in summertime is going to attract biofouling organisms, things like mussels, barnacles, tentacles, other ones. And they will close off the meshes in your gear, and they have to be kept open so that you get maximum water flow so the oysters grow as fast as they can. So that cleaning process is something that needs to be taken care of. The other leases that we have are traditional bottom leases. These are made to emulate a natural oyster reef. And we've worked with these folks for a long time here in Maryland. We have statewide training available to growers to teach them how to do things like set their oysters on year-old aged oyster shell called remote setting. My colleague Don Merritt, who's in the center of that top left picture, it was developed in the Pacific Northwest, and he brought that back here in the early 1980s. We use that with a lot of our growers, and it's become very popular. When we developed our training programs about 10 years ago, when we revised our leasing laws, we placed 38 remote setting systems in various areas around the bay, and growers can book those for a 2-week period during July and August. The units have pumps to pump the ambient water into them. They have aeration to provide air in the bottom of the tanks. You can see the aeration flowing in there. You shut off the water, turn the air on, put larvae in the tanks, and then the aeration circulates the larvae through the oyster shell, where they attach and go through metamorphosis. So those tanks are made. The growers can use those in the summertime. They use them for a year or two, and then we will consult with them on building systems for their own size operation. In the bottom right there is one of our growers over here on the shore who has about 125 acres now spread through about 4 different counties, and does a very, very good job of setting and moving oysters. Spout on shell bottom culture does still have the most acreage. Right now, we have, between the leases we have in active production and the applications that are going through the state process, we'll have about 10,000 acres in active production, hopefully very soon. The growers will build their own systems. They will containerize. This is year-old aged oyster shell. They'll purchase larvae from a hatchery, place it into the tank. You can see the picture of an eyed larvae down there in the bottom. Place it into the tank, and those oysters will set, and then they'll put them overboard. The gentleman who's doing that is Robert T. Brown, who's president of the Maryland Watermen's Association. He has about 10 setting systems that he uses both for his own grounds, as well as producing oysters for sale to the state, where they place them on some of the public harvest grounds to help our public fishery. Spout on shell bottom culture has been very interesting. It really has not progressed all that far when you look at it. What we're still doing is flushing oyster seed off a planting vessel. In order to monitor it, we either use divers or patent tongs, which are lowered to the bottom. They're pulled together with a hydraulic cylinder and pulled back up. They do a good job of showing you what's down there in about a square meter. The other device is the towed oyster dredge, which is rather inefficient for trying to judge what your populations are on the ground. As well as from research, we know that the dredge kills small oysters and spreads out the important bottom substrate. So generally what I do is make the point that with bottom culture right now, other than the advances that have been made with hatchery technology and the like, we're still somewhere in the ag equivalent between Amish horse-drawn implements and a 1950 farm all H. We really need to get into modern technology to increase production, as I believe we can, and really get back in the market to where we were doing millions of bushels years ago. How do I get started? Well, first of all, learn all you can about the business. Find the information that's online. We have a lot of it out there. We normally, in a good year when COVID hasn't hit us, we've been doing about 12 to 20 individual workshops, evening programs, field visits, and conferences throughout the year. Um, we hope to be able to get back to that soon. Investigate your markets. One of the things that we're seeing, especially with the single oysters for the raw bar and half shell trade, even before COVID hit, is that they've basically saturated a lot of the markets. Wholesalers are not taking on anymore. Um, this has not only been down here in Maryland, but also up in New England, where they've had rather severe problems, as well as in the Gulf Coast, where they're trying to get into that those individual single oysters, which are worth more money. Determine your lease type and location, where you'd like to go, what type of lease you'd like to have. Critical step, develop your business plan. My colleague, Matt Parker, is our aquaculture business specialist. He is available to work with you. He will help you to develop a business plan. We do have a lot of good information online with that, but you really, really need to do that and put a lot of thought in it before you get into the business. Then arrange for financing. We'll show you some programs to do that. File your application for a lease here in Maryland, as well as a federal permit required, and create a relationship with a hatchery or hatcheries. And this is critical as well to be able to get your animals. We have the Horn Point Hatchery starts taking orders at midnight on New Year's Day. We have growers that wait until that clock strikes 12:01 to send their order for the year into them. So you really need to think about doing that. Extension training. We have a really good extension program here in Maryland. I'm very proud to have been a part of it for a number of years. We have a lot of this that came about once we revised our lease program about a decade ago for the first time in 100 years. We got rid of a lot of the barnacles that had accumulated on it over the years. Did things like getting rid of minimum and maximum size leases. There was a ban on corporations holding leases, probably illegal here in Maryland anyway. There was a mandate you could only have one lease. Our leaseholders had figured out how to get around that decades ago. But there was a lot of money put into extension training and support programs. NOAA gave us funds for the first 4 years, and then the Radcliffe Foundation for the next four. And we developed a lot of our training programs. They fell in different areas: production systems, business management, seafood technology. In production systems, we would teach coastal seed setting, nursery operations, remote setting, spout on shell. Talked about, had programs on genetics, what you need to know about oyster genetics, disease management, which has been and will always be a critical issue here. How to use sonar mapping to run a lease better, pest and predator management, contained gear methods, and then data collection and application. In business management, we do programs on basic and advanced planning, risk management, finance, marketing and sales, internet and social media use, as well as tax management. We've had some gentleman who was a specialist in agricultural tax management came in and talked to a lot of our growers about it. Maryland does have the ability, if you are a leaseholder, you can get a shellfish shipper license, which allows you to sell your oysters direct to consumers. But that requires HACCP training, or hazard analysis critical control point. We do that training annually with my colleague Kathy Liu and our friends in the Maryland Department of Health. She also teaches seafood safety through care of the catch and additional HACCP courses throughout the year. We have done short courses in oyster hatchery management about 4 times over the last decade. These were week-long programs where we did lectures in the morning from some great colleagues who were tops in their field, people like Gary Wickfors from the NOAA Milford Lab, Stan Allen, who's one of the chief people doing breeding and selection work. And then in the afternoon, we'd go back in the hatchery and you do hands-on with the hatchery to learn what was going on down there. The hatchery also offers internships during the summer. They have their applications out now. They will be taking them, closeout for that is early February. They hire about 8 people during the summer, and you get in there and learn all hatchery operations, as well as the demonstration oyster farm that I've already pointed out to you, serves as our underwater agricultural experiment station. With resources, we have an extension website that has a lot of information on it. Our Meet the Industry section has photographs of a lot of our working farms. Getting Started has a link to our Department of Natural Resources Oyster Lease siting tool. And that is one where basically you can go on and see, it shows you where you can't get a lease. It has places like in areas that have submerged aquatic vegetation beds. There are clearance zones around navigation channels and things of this sort. But it's a really good idea, as well as health department ratings of water quality for approved, conditional, restricted, and prohibited waters. It's a really good way to start looking at where you might want to get an oyster lease. And the resources tab has takes you to our publications, has downloadable publications and spreadsheets that can help you learn and plan for your business. Programs are announced on the site, as well as providing archive information from past programs. And we also operate the Maryland Aquaculture Facebook page for a notification of upcoming programs. Financial assistance in Maryland, there's a range of things to do at MARBIDCO, which is the Maryland Agriculture and Resource-Based Industries Development Corporation. It's a little agency with the longest name in Maryland, but they have programs that are provide low interest loans for both lease development as well as oyster setting systems. You can borrow up to $300,000, very user-friendly to do that. You pay quarterly interest payments while oysters are growing. And if you keep up on those payments, when you start to pay back the principal, you get a 40% reduction in principal on the first 100,000, 25% on the balance. Very, very attractive. USDA, Natural Resources Conservation Service, has environmental quality improvement project grants for bottom habitat development for bottom leases. The Southern Maryland Ag Development Corporation, which is on the western shore down near the Potomac River counties, they have loans for gear purchases through their animal agriculture program. USDA's Farm Service Agency has crop insurance available at low or no cost, and that's no cost for beginning farmers, those who have been in it for up to 10 years, as well as low interest loans for other items. For information on those and other sources, you can access the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's aquaculture funding database. Bay Foundation is one of the largest environmental groups in the Chesapeake Bay area. We partnered with them a couple of years ago to create the Maryland Shellfish Growers Network, and that aquaculture funding database is one of the outputs of that. They've been a very good organization to deal with. To get a lease in Maryland, you go through the Natural Resources Department's Aquaculture and Industry Enhancement Unit. Great bunch of people. We consolidated all of our leasing into this single agency back about 2012 for both bottom water column leases as well as any other type of aquaculture. They coordinate the aquaculture permitting for everything. They will process lease applications as well as the Army Corps of Engineer permits that are required for operating. They handle a public notification process that's required for public notification of a lease, as well as doing informational meetings if there are any protests, and taking that through the court system with the Office of Attorney General. They track lease use. If you have a lease, you have to file monthly harvest reports, whether or not you harvest anything, as well as the annual rental fee and the annual questionnaire on what you've done with your lease. You can get a lease in Maryland, but it's an active use lease. If you're going to lease it, it's a public resource. You must use it. And we have requirements for what you have to plant on it, as well as the fact that you have to use it on a regular basis. So their unit also, as I said, coordinates with the Army Corps. We operate now under their nationwide Permit 48. And they also provide operational support for the Aquaculture Coordinating Council and the review board that work with the industry. Lease protests, as I said, we're operating a common property resource. The bay belongs to all of the people of the state of Maryland. Members of the public have a right to voice their concerns if someone wants to lease a portion of it. However, a lot of those happen to be things where somebody who lives on the shore just doesn't want to see it. And we have a series of steps they go through: mediation, public information meetings before it goes into the administrative law court. A lot of times folks will use that to try to dissuade applicants by proceeding, by creating time lags for those startup businesses. But I will say that government support has been critical, and the state of Maryland has been absolutely marvelous. The Attorney General's office has successfully represented the department all through these, and has in several instances set legal precedent that says if the department follows procedures laid down by the legislature, the fact that someone doesn't want to see a lease in front of them doesn't matter. We've seen annual attempts at restricting legislation that would go for the NIMBY issue. So far, it's been thwarted by legislators who do understand the value of shellfish aquaculture. But one of the questions that's come up over the years is, what does constitute standing for a protest? Does someone who lives, say, in Frederick County in central Maryland have the right to protest a lease that may be on the Eastern Shore? So one of the things that's really helped the industry tremendously has been breeding and selection. My colleagues at both Virginia Institute of Marine Science and Rutgers have done marvelous work with Stan Allen, who runs the VIMS Aquaculture Breeding and Genetics Technology Center down at VIMS, has done a great deal of work in breeding animals that would be resistant to both MSX and dermo, the two diseases that wiped out a lot of our natural stocks. You can see how corn has developed over there on the left, and to understand we're about here with oysters right now. In fact, it's been very interesting that he has growers that have come to him and said, don't spend so much time creating, putting into disease resistance. If you can give us animals that grow faster and have higher meat yield, basically a lot of the disease problems go away. We can get them out in a year or 2 years, which would beat the disease problems that beset them. But this has been a large part of the industry, and we hope to see this continue, as we've done with agriculture. You don't have one soybean seed or one corn seed, even here on the Eastern Shore. It depends on the soil types and the time you plant it, and what you're going to do with them. One of the things I want to bring up is the advanced technology. University of Maryland was recently awarded a 5-year, $10 million project by U.S. Department of Agriculture to bring advanced technology and robotics to the bottom culture of oysters for high volume production. Frankly, my view of this is where we want to go is back to the point where we were in the millions of bushels of oysters, to where we could take those and get them into mass markets. University of Maryland will be the lead institution on this project, which we've termed S3AM, or Smart Sustainable Shellfish Aquaculture Management. It has research, extension, and education components in various U.S. coastal regions. Research, extension, education. This is land grant, and this is USDA. And this is applying modern technology to advance ground management, planting and harvesting practices, and hopefully get into mechanized processing, added value products, and marketing for industry expansion. As I've told a lot of my growers, conceive, what I want to see is Wendy's and Popeyes and Burger King arguing over who's got the best oyster sandwich in the future. The S3AM project, we've already had the technology with our engineers and robotics technicians who've been out with some of our growers, taking underwater drone shots, brought them back, and developing data for some of those early applications from that. This is the 5 objectives of that project. One will be to develop the technologies, both drone-based environmental and crop monitoring, so you'll be able to not only be able to plant oysters more regularly and monitor them on a regular basis to see how they're doing, but then also create smart harvesting to either remove specific sizes or 100% of the animals to remove a potential disease sink, and they create management tools for farmers. The other objective will be to move from the laboratory, where things will be initially, out into farm field trials in both the East, West, and Gulf Coast regions. This is to move them into areas of different hydrologic backgrounds. And we have about a 2-foot rise and fall of tide here in the Bay, which is far different from New England or the Pacific Northwest. The economics are critical, and we have economists who will be working on that to look at economic models and cost assessment and profitability, and then integrate that knowledge into education models, both in 4-H. Maryland has a very effective 4-H robotics program already. We hope to get them wet in the future, and then also to move into undergraduate curricula and summer research, and then to build a national extension network, engage our stakeholders, and eventually disseminate that knowledge and outcome across the country. That's the logo down there in the bottom right that has all of us working together to try to move the industry into the 21st century. This is the S3AM team, the folks up the top, University of Maryland, the engineers on the right, extension folks on the on the left, the extension folks on the right. Also involves University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, Louisiana State University, Virginia Tech, Pacific Shellfish Institute, University of Maryland Eastern Shore, and the Fraunhofer USA Institute. Research, extension, and education, developing advanced technology to increase profitable production. We certainly hope to see how that comes in the future. Well, thank you very much. There's my contact information. If anybody wants to get in touch with me, I'd be glad to help you out.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. I think we've had a couple questions come into the chat during the presentation. The first one was on the bottom lease seed slide, and it was from Sam. He said, how often are the oysters tumbled?
It depends where you are and how your biofouling is. I mean, our guys go out there and check them on a fairly regular basis, from several weeks in the summer to not at all during the winter, really, because there's not much going on with them.
And then our next question was from Paul, and I think you might have covered it because he asked it before you got to these slides, but he said, could you provide an update to the 10 million multi-year USDA grant focused on shellfish automation robotics led by University of Maryland?
Yeah, I hope those slides were able to cover that. But it was very interesting how that occurred. I was asked by the Maryland robotics faculty to come into a retreat they had 2 years ago in last December, and provide an overview of aquaculture to them. And they got very, very interested in it. Called me the next day and said, we've voted to support 2 postdoc positions in agriculture and aquaculture. I thought, well, that's great. And then from that, we started talking and decided we really want to see this move forward and to try to bring this technology into the century we're all in now. You know, you can't be interested in agriculture without being very impressed with where it's gone over the years. I mean, when I first got here, it's far different than when I first started working. The moldboard plow is a thing that you find in museums anymore. Drones are now used to survey, hundreds and thousands of acres rather than walking through crops to see firsthand, what's going on. We have tractors and combines that you've gotten to the point where you could sit in a command center miles away and operate them. We don't have that in shellfish aquaculture. We need to get there, and that's hopefully where we're going to go.
Sounds good. And then our next question comes from Mark, and he says, how long does it take to get a lease now?
It's been taking over a year, normally, basically because of the crush. In 2000, we've had governors who really tried to change the Maryland lease program for the past century, and they were always cut off by our commercial harvesters. In 2008, we had reached the point where we basically didn't have anything, much of a public fishery, or And the governor at that time, with Natural Resources Secretary, was one of the best I ever worked with, convinced the governor he really needed to push this. A lot of us worked very diligently to point out where all of the problems were with the Maryland lease program. 6 counties in Maryland would not even allow any new leases. You had minimum and maximum size leases. They said you couldn't be a corporation to have a lease. Oh, non-residents, oh my goodness, non-resident couldn't have a lease in Maryland. A lot of us spent a lot of time in 2008 sitting down and redesigning the entire lease program. And amazingly, it went through the legislature unanimously in both houses. And then we took about a year to include that in a state of Maryland oyster management plan and started leasing again in September 2010. The crush of leases applications that came in was pretty substantial. At the time, water column leases would go through several other agencies. Bottom leases were in DNR. So in 2012, we rolled everything back into the single agency, the Aquaculture and Industry Enhancement Unit. They handle things. They've got a very good staff that does it. But still, because of the crush of applications, it's still taking over a year to get a lease. What we want to get to is a maximum of about 9 months. I'd love to see a minimum of 4 months. So somebody could come in, apply, and get one. But it's been very interesting watching it. We finally, at the last Aquaculture Coordinating Council meeting, notified by the department, we have finally gotten below 100 lease applications. Every time we would get there, there'd be another spate of them that would come in.
Thank you. John's question is, you mentioned about the mud crabs in Maryland. This is actually my first time hearing about it here in the state. How good is the marketing of this crab here?
I'm sorry, I didn't mention mud crabs. I talked about blue crabs. How good is the marketing of blue crabs? That's a staple for our industry. That's multi-million-dollar industry.
All right, that was the last question in the chat. If anyone has any additional questions, and John says, my bad. Let's see, Anthony just said, thoughts about the Washington Post article, which is solar powered barge could take oyster farming deeper into the Chesapeake.
Yeah, that's Maritime Applied Physics up in Baltimore. They're a military contractor. I've been up there for several meetings and seen the units as they were developing them. It's a very interesting concept. And basically what it is, there are rafts that have units in them with cylindrical cages that rotate down and then back up again. As they come back up, they desiccate, and then they're sprayed off with a water bar and then go back down again. The units are about 12 feet below the surface of the water. So you need somewhere that would be probably in the Chesapeake, a minimum of probably about 20 feet of water. And it all runs with solar power. Their design concept on it is that you could produce up to 4 million oysters an acre with those units. It's very interesting technology. We've discussed it with them. I think number one, there's got to be ways that they can. We don't have a whole lot of places in the bay that were near shore that you could put those. And I started looking initially at places over here on the Eastern Shore where you might be able to put them, and there really are very few, because most of the time when you find that kind of water depth, you're in a navigation channel, and we're not going to give you a lease there. Basically, what they're talking about is you can move these offshore, maybe a mile, half a mile or so, where there are water depths. Anchor them there and have be able to raise oysters there. Interesting concept. I don't know. I don't know what the profitability would be for them. They are very expensive in some of the numbers we've seen for them. I don't know how they would fare in icing conditions. We've not had severe icing here in the bay for a number of years. Back in my early years in the late 70s, 77, 78, 79, we had 3 severe winters in a row. 77, 3/4 of the bay froze. It looked like the Arctic. And we actually had lighthouses that lean at 20-degree angle now that were pushed over from ice in those years. If you had something anchored out, that would be severe problems. The question is, I don't know where it's going. It's interesting technology. I love to see people getting into those things. The folks who have done it, I'm really dying to see how these things work out, and what the where they may end up and what the production of them would be. The answer, from a marketing standpoint, I don't know profitability wise.
And we had another question come in from Joel, which he asked, what types of surface cages can be rolled in the water to reduce handle time?
What type of surface gear can be?
What type of surface cages can be rolled into the water to reduce handle time?
The ones I've seen, we have one of our largest growers, a gentleman over on the St. Mary's shore, who now those were some of the pictures you saw of his. He probably had more of them out there than anybody else. They go overboard very easily. I mean, he has mechanized equipment like forklifts and all that take them from the land down to the water, get them started, and then guys that go down and take them and pull them out onto the lines. They've been very effective at raising oysters. He's one who has he's very innovative. He's now in the process of building an oyster hatchery. But the oyster grow cages and go deeps they're very interesting technology. The floats on them do a good job. They're very tough. There's also a company up in New England that's making a smaller variation of them now that is quote less obtrusive and may not be as objectionable to some shoreline property owners. That whole NIMBY issue has been very interesting to me over time. I understand where people are coming from, and I'm not sure I'd want to live next to a marina full of clanking sailboat masts, but to a sailor that would be like Brahms' lullaby at night. And we've seen quotes from folks. Like one of my favorite was from down in a hearing down in Virginia, where a gentleman got up and said, "I paid $1 million for this house. I thought I controlled to the horizon." No, I'm sorry, sir, you don't. It's a public resource. So I've always pointed out here that the bay belongs as much to a coal miner in Garrett County, a Rockville businessman, a Havre de Grace housewife, a Frederick farmer, a Dundalk dock worker, as it does to somebody who lives next to it, or a waterman who family may have worked on it for 100 years. And our government has decided that it's a priority issue to try to use it to raise oysters and build the economy, employment, and help the environment.
And I'm sorry, there was a correction to Joel's question. He said, to be clear, my question is how to roll the float while on lines to avoid taking them out of the floats and roll them to get better shape.
How to roll them while they're on the line. The ones who are doing that, actually, they're in fairly shallow water. They go overboard and they have guys who wade out and do it. I don't know of any floats that are out in deep water. Almost all the deep water grow out we have with contained culture is bottom cages.
All right, and our last question is from Lee, and they say, has any thought been given to reworking some of the funding to not be limited to just oysters? We do bay scallops here on Chesapeake Bay and find it hard to get funding because of all the funding requirements are limited to just oysters. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, you have to understand here in the Chesapeake, we're pretty well limited to oysters. Now, we do have growers on our coastal bays, which are high salinity, that have raised clams. And there has been interest in raising bay scallops over there. So far, no, the Marbidco money, that is probably the most beneficial, has not been allocated for that. Could be, yeah, if it becomes an issue. It's been very interesting. One of the things I've pointed out to folks, I think we did a very, very good job of revising our lease program and setting up a whole series of support programs for shellfish leasing. And we tried to foresee all the problems that would occur, but you can't. I have a colleague who has always said, he's a glass half empty kind of guy, and I'm a glass half full kind of guy. And I point out with our lease program, I think our glass is about 85% full. But there's always speed bumps and potholes along the way. And we hit those frequently. And then the groups like the Aquaculture Coordinating Council has to try to solve those. We've done that with many issues. We have some really, really good friends in the Maryland legislature. One who's been with us since the start is a state senator from Baltimore County who has absolutely no aquaculture in her district, but she has been one of our strongest supporters and longtime friends. Yeah, if we get into other shellfish species in the coastal bays, or one of the things we're looking at now is, we can't raise sugar kelp in the Chesapeake, but there are other forms of aquatic plants that might be beneficial here. We did some work with Gracilaria a few years ago, and we're in the process of modifying our leasing law to allow the DNR to issue permits for aquatic plants in the future.
Thank you. It's about 2:00, so I know people have meetings and everything. So I'll wrap up and say thank you again, Mr. Webster, for presenting for us today on aquaculture, and his information is here on the slide. And I've also included the ACE Center information in the chat. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Megan. Thank you to all of you for coming in and watching the show. And when we get out of COVID, come visit.
Sounds good. And the recording will be sent out to everyone. Have a great day.
You too.